his works were primarily in terms of Arabic and in terms of history. He was family of the Prophet ﷺ as well. And he was probably one of the few in the latter age, non-Arabs, that the funeral prayer in absentia, Salatul Janaza al-Ghaib, was performed both in the Haram of Mecca and the Haram of Medina. He passed away on a Friday. So his works were primarily in Arabic and history, very much in history. There are very few Islamic seminaries that I know of that they don't use his works in terms of Arabic readers. And for a non-Arab, in other words, for an Indian scholar, ethnically Indian scholar, to gain such a claim in the Arab world speaks volumes of the person. So his works aren't only taught like in the Indo-Sub curriculum, but it's taught the world over in different seminaries. Nevertheless, he writes in Arabic and he writes in history. He was a contemporary and a thinker. This is an example of contemporary leadership that should be aspired to. In terms of history, so we're talking about this overlap, and as a result of the overlap, we have assimilation. So he gives us an example in terms of the Arab example, the Arabian Peninsula. So what we have is that Muslims, they move out of the Arabian Peninsula. By the time the Prophet ﷺ had passed away in the 11th year after Hijrah, by that time, the entire Arabian Peninsula had come under the control of the Muslims. Muslims were controlling it. But then Islam expanded. So when Islam expanded, the ruling powers at the time were two. It was the Roman Empire and it was the Persian Empire. So now the Muslims came into contact with both the Roman and the Persian empires, and they would ultimately conquer those empires and those regions. But normally what happens is the Arabs, they came from a Bedouin culture, which is a very simplistic culture. So they come out of the Arabian Peninsula and they're exposed now to a more developed culture. Now the normal rule, Shaykh Abul Hassan Ali Nadwi says, is that when a lesser culture is exposed to a more developed culture, what happens is they abandon their ways and they adopt the ways of the more developed culture. That's like a standard. And if you wanted to, you can almost like think to yourself that Muslim minority is an overlap in terms of modernity. So what's going to happen? It's almost like a natural consequence, if you don't safeguard against it, that the minority is going to be subsumed by the majority. And therefore it's very important consciously that we don't have this type of response to the context that we find ourselves in. It's very problematic, and we see what issues it actually leads to. So in this historical case, Abul Hassan Ali Nadwi asked the question. For him, he says it's a puzzle. He says puzzle. Actually, the context for this talk that he was delivering, he was to female students at one of the universities in the Arab world. He was relating to female students. So he says, what is this puzzle? How come it didn't happen? How come the Arabs, who had a lesser culture, weren't subsumed by that higher, more sophisticated culture which was had and the Persians? He says it's because before the Arabs left the Arabian Peninsula, right, they were insulated in terms of their belief. And because they were insulated in terms of their belief, when they were exposed to what appeared to be a more sophisticated and a complex culture, they realized the value of what they had, and they didn't abandon it. They held on to it, despite ostensibly facing a more developed and more sophisticated culture. So if you think about us, he was addressing women folk. So if you think about us in terms of our homes, in your home, if you're able to insulate your children, in other words, plant the seeds of Iman in terms of their identity, and instill within them the proper ethics and morals, and insulate them in that way, when they go out, then like the Arabs who were exposed to more seemingly sophisticated cultures, they didn't buy into that facade. They didn't fall for the apparent glitter and glamour of that way, which is really empty. They didn't fall for that. So likewise, if we do the same thing in terms of our kids, and we plant the seeds of belief, proper identity, and proper character development within the home, when they go out, they'll be insulated, and we won't have this problem of assimilation. In other words, the overlap will be our context. It will always be our context. But we won't fall prey to it. It won't become our excuse, in other words. So yesterday we'd spoken about this particular phenomenon. If you look at the situation we find ourselves in, we have this overlap, and our response to the overlap is, number one, is we assimilate. That's very problematic. That is very problematic. One of the ways of safeguarding, and I'm going to mention it here and I'll maybe mention it later on as well, it is becoming a big challenge going forward. Just this morning we received an application for a young lady, and she wants to register at our afternoon madrasa. So our afternoon madrasa, I'm not canvassing for my afternoon madrasa, I'm canvassing for afternoon madrasas in general. What purpose does it serve? It serves a very important supplementary purpose. When you send your kid to school in the morning, so their cognitive needs are seen to, they do maths, they do science, they do English and everything else. And increasingly now, the physical needs are being seen to in terms of extramural activity. Yeah. But very importantly, if a person is going to a run-of-the-mill government school, secular school or Model C school, what is lacking? What is lacking is that the identity development in terms of iman and the character development in terms of akhlaq, that is not being seen to. And this is the reality. So therefore, the afternoon supplementary school is very, very important. And I think there should be a bit of a balance in that particular regard. You can't be having a certain type of social engineering from 8 till 4 in the day, and then a Saturday class is going to work. Saturday class is better than nothing, yes, but we need a bit more than just that. And I think it's very important in that regard. So this young girl is enrolling, but the mother is also orientating to us in terms of what we can expect from the girl. So the issues which are raised, this is now in the interview. So what's happening is, look, they are taken by the idea of LGBTQ. So if we can speak to that. Because of the secular background that she's coming from, she doesn't really want to enroll. So the mother has to tighten the screws a bit, in terms of getting her to enroll. And uniquely enough, and this is a point we're going to mention later on, young women, 50 years after women liberation, we find that in terms of mental challenges and psychological challenges, young women are beset with these challenges. Amongst them would be things like depression, depression leading to suicidal thoughts and so forth. This is the orientation that we are getting. So whereas women's liberation should have led to happiness, we find that the perceived objective of women liberation from a Western perspective, the perceived goals have not been achieved. Okay. So I'm just mentioning that as an example in terms of with the overlap in the context that we find ourselves, we need to be wary of the overlap. And the overlap should not result in assimilation. So that's the first type of reaction. We sort of like go with the flow, do in Rome like the Romans do. And then we maintain sort of like a facade in terms of our Islamness, and that's very problematic. A type of leadership that makes you feel comfortable with that type of compromise, that sort of leadership needs to be questioned. So we spoke about that. Then we spoke about those of us that we sort of resist this overlap in terms of modernity, and we find some sort of comfort in the fact that, like a century or two ago, we were the rulers of the world. That doesn't help much, because that historical greatness that we experience was great in its time, but it doesn't have any value for us currently, except that it serves as a lesson in terms of where we went right and where we went wrong. So that's the second type of reaction that we spoke about. This is a very unique point in terms of the history, and so we shouldn't, as Muslims, gloat about it too much. And we gave a few examples. We developed the water clock, and we are responsible for translating all of Aristotle's works from Greek into Arabic, and our type of logic. Yesterday, we had a discussion, Mona Zakaria was mentioning that basic Islamic literature that runs back for a few hundred years, the basic literature contains more developed logic than what you study at university level. That is true. But what type of contributions are we making to modern logic, to formal logic, or whatever the case may be? Those are the very important questions that we need to ask ourselves. So we're talking about, this is a tangent point, but I'll tie it into leadership, inshallah. And the basic idea behind it is that on the third point is we're talking about leadership. So al-isnadu min ad-din fanzuru amman ta'khuduna dinakum, that you should be wary in terms of whom you take your religion from, particularly in terms of the context. If your leadership is making you feel comfortable in the first one, then is this the right leadership? And you should maybe be asking yourself the question, because you are a leader in a particular regard. So if I consider you to be the leader of your family, and this is the position that you take, it's okay. We can just compromise at the drop of a hat. No scarf, it's fine. It's fine, that your nakedness is exposed in relation to your son. If that's the type of leadership, then you need to rethink your leadership in your context. And the same applies to number two. Number three is what we're going to be speaking about today in terms of the context. You find another type of reaction, and that is basically there's an explosion of rage. That you don't take the first position, you don't take the second position, but there's an explosion of rage. So what happens is we sort of retreat into the strictest possible interpretation that we can find of religion. So because of the overlap, we feel threatened, and our response to the threat is that we're going to appropriate the strictest view, and that is going to basically be our form of opposition to what is happening out there. And this is a very challenging one. So what do we tell ourselves? Never mind the largesse, never mind the degree of latitude contained within our spiritual works. Never mind the degree of latitude in terms of Islamic ethics. Never mind the degree of latitude which is contained within the 4 schools of thought. What we're going to do is we're going to roll up into like a ball, similar to a hedgehog, and anybody who comes close to us, we're going to prick them. That is another type of approach, and this is a very, very problematic type of approach. If you wanted to, you can say my way or the highway. It's very unique for me because if you look at a school of thought, then we have 4 schools of thought, and then we have a number of original thinkers whose views also make part of what we refer to as the Sharia. Now, it is very important for us that we don't have this approach where when we're being challenged, and then the more we are challenged, as opposed to accessing that latitude contained within our tradition, we become all the more strict, and we feel this is the most appropriate way to deal with the challenge that is presenting ourselves. As opposed to that, if you look at the context which Muslims find themselves in, with this overlap, they find themselves in a modern, fast-paced world where things are changing almost on a daily basis. It is at this point in time where we must start accessing that latitude which is contained within our Sharia, which is very, very important. So we should actually be accessing those dispensations found within our Sharia to facilitate ease for people. And this is a much better response than making things difficult for people. And Allah knows this. Yeah. There was a word that one of our scholars used, and I wrote down the definition because I found it very interesting. He says we should be having a dialogical approach. In other words, there must be a dialogue. What do we mean thereby? We mean thereby that you need to be able to understand the different perspectives to a given issue, and understand the different views that scholars may hold in that particular regard. And in doing so, you don't limit something which is very, very wide. Yeah. So what's going to happen when we become altogether strict? We feel threatened, and our knee-jerk response to that is we become overly strict. What happens as a result of that? We become all the more exclusive. So in other words, like what you call the people on the truth. What happens is because you become so strict and you become so limited, automatically this group that's supposedly on the truth becomes all the smaller, and smaller. You become exclusive. And the moment you become exclusive, you become irrelevant. And that's basically what happens. If you look at a real hardliner, we're now in a difficult situation. We need to take the hardest line. And in taking the hardest line, we're going to preserve our Islam. But when you take the hardest line, what happens? You become exclusive. The more exclusive you become, the more irrelevant you become. You only really appease yourself in saying that I'm on the truth. But in terms of being relevant to the Muslim community that you're supposed to be serving, you're completely irrelevant. And that really is the punishment if you look at it in terms of taking a hard line. The consequence of taking an unnecessarily hard line is that you become irrelevant. You're no more relevant. And that's basically, when you become irrelevant, you can, stand on your head. Nobody's going to be listening to you. So in terms of this type of approach, when we are challenged and now we sort of, the challenges that we face, the external forces that pressure ourselves, we don't fall into the first category or second category. What becomes of us? We become hardliners. This is not a correct type of response to the challenges that we are faced with. I just want to read the definition here of dialogical. It says it refers to thinking that involves a dialogue between different points of views, different cognitive domains, and different frameworks of reference. Like you have different frameworks of reference. So dialogue means that you're able to understand things from a different perspective, not only from my perspective. I can even understand things from different cognitive thinking. If you look at the form of dialogue, you find that something is permissible in one school of thought, but it's not permissible in another school of thought. So to say like, this is right and this is completely wrong, that's not like a dialogical type of thinking. That's a very hard line type of thinking. But to understand that this is basically where they come from, this is where we come from, I can live and I can not live. That type of attitude will do what? Number one is you broadening the scope of that which is correct, and more people fall into the ambit of that which is correct, as opposed to taking a hard line, my way or the highway. Then you become exclusive, and then everybody else is on misguidance, and you're the only one on guidance. This type of knee-jerk, hard-line reaction to the context that we find ourselves in, it's very problematic. And it goes against the narration of the Prophet ﷺ. He talks about yassiru wa la tu'assiru, bashiru wa la tunaffiru. The Prophet ﷺ says, yassiru, make things easy. Wa la tu'assiru, don't make things difficult. Bashiru, give people glad tidings. Wa la tunaffiru, don't say things to people in such a way that actually repels them and chases them away from our Islam. What we find many times, people, like you and I, we maybe look for the strictest type of view, and then once we stumble across the strictest view, then we start promoting it. And what do we say? Everybody else who doesn't follow this view, they are on misguidance. So maybe we spend a whole afternoon on a social platform after we discovered what we deem to be the truth. And that's like the hardliner approach. And then everybody else who doesn't subscribe to the hardliner approach, that person is wayward, the person is misguided, and all of those type of things. There's a very beautiful narration of the Prophet ﷺ. It talks about مَا خُيِّرَ بَيْنَ أَمْرَيْنِ إِلَّا اخْتَارَ أَيْسَرَهُمَا. The Prophet ﷺ wasn't given an option between two things, except that he chose the easier of the two. Of the two. So some of our scholars, they coinage for this. They say it is an exercise in competitive narrowness, competitive strictness. That if you're going to be strict, then I can show you how I can be even more stricter. And this was never the nature of our Islam. The nature of Islam was always very broad and always very encompassing. So much so that our scholars, they talk about ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim as an anecdotal point. They say that the word sirat means path. The word sabil also means path. So if you just like sort of focus on the word sirat for now and ask the question, why does Allah use the word sirat as opposed to using the word sabil? So they say that sabil refers to a path, but that path is like, relatively speaking, a narrow path. But sirat, that Allah asks you to guide, is a very broad path. So that particular broad path, who does it encompass? It encompasses you It encompasses your view, which is based on your cognitive framework, on your, what was it word now again? Your frames of reference, you know, it includes you, but it's broad enough to include everybody else as well. And Allah SWT knows best. So now when you're exposed to a leadership that is hard bent on exercises in competitive narrowness, something which Imam Ghazali rahimahullah speaks heavily against, and then you should basically put a question mark over there. That is somewhat of a problem. This type of knee-jerk response to the overlapping in our context is very problematic. I want to maybe give you one or two examples in this particular regard. And sometimes these issues are like, it's really, one doesn't know what to make of it sometimes, Wallahu A'lam. So you find that, you know, and it's also maybe not the most palatable example, but this is a real example whereby we can, number one is we get into nitty-gritty and we don't have an order of priority. You know, what do they call awlawiyat? You know, there's a sense of, you know, that perhaps in a certain context is an important issue, but in looking at the issues that we face as a Muslim community, that at this point in time is not the most important thing, but we will, you know, cut hairs in terms of one particular thing like that. So, you know, in the Shafi school of thought, they talk about when you go relieve yourself. So what happens is that when you relieve yourself is you can use, you can either use stones, and the stone equivalent would be what we refer to as toilet paper, or you can use water. The best is to use both, like toilet paper to remove the impurity. And sometimes we have this macho idea that, you know, I don't use toilet paper, I just use water. The Sharia doesn't really have a consideration for that, because Sharia looks at it from a different perspective. The Sharia actually tells you it's better for you to use toilet paper. Why? Because you remove the corpus of the impurity and you don't have direct contact with impurity, because Sharia has an aversion for any type of impurities. Not that you develop an OCD about it, but that's the ideal from the Sharia perspective. You remove the corpus of and then what happens is when you use the water, and now your direct contact when you're using water to purify yourself, your contact with the impurities is much less. So ideally you use toilet paper and water. If it's either or, then you're going to use water as opposed to toilet paper. Is it permissible for you to only use toilet paper? Absolutely, you can use toilet paper. Now what happens is in the issue of stones, our scholars say that the stones must be dry. You mustn't use wet stones. Now what happens is, so people have a habit in terms of toilet paper, and then they wet the toilet paper and they use that. So are you going to apply the same ruling? I don't have an issue with discussing the particular issue, but to make this the most important issue, you know, that look, it is, you know, I've been sent with the responsibility to ensure whatever platform I can possibly be on, that it's my duty to tell people that if you are guilty of cleaning yourself with wet toilet paper, then I'm available to help you calculate how much of your salahs you must repeat, etc., etc., etc. That becomes very problematic. And that's an example of an exercise in competitive narrowness. What should we be doing? We should be looking at, it's a given rule within the madahib, that hamlun nasi ala aysari madahib, that you carry people, particularly if something happened in retrospect, that you carry people on the easiest of rulings. So what happens when we carry people on the easiest of rulings? What happens is you find that the ambit of the Sharia is broadened, and everybody finds a place within a particular ambit. And this is important, because if you take the narrow line, and now everybody's narrow, so very few people can be there. I'll give you an extraneous example in terms of how far-reaching this particular methodology can go to. In Aqidah, we believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So your Aqidah, everybody's on a different level when it comes to his or her belief. Right? So many people maybe, and it's not a problem in that regard, basically simply following that, look, I was born in a Muslim household, my parents were Muslim, and I subscribe to Islam through my parents. Are you with me? Some scholars say no, that is not sufficient for you to be a believer. you have to come to that certainty all by yourself in a very formal way. So the response to that would be that if we're going to make it mandatory that every single person, you must come to the gnosis of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through this particular formal way, then how many people are we going to include in Islam and how many people are we going to exclude? So then the argument which the scholars bring is, why must you narrow something which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has broadened? So if you are deemed in Allah's eyes as a believer, no matter what your mode of belief is, you still fall within the broad ambit of being a believer, though there may be different levels in terms of belief. But why limit something which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has kept open? And they even go on to say, why limit the amount of people who's destined for the gardens of bliss? Because that's in essence what you're saying when you say that they don't meet the criterion. So there you have another example in terms of how we shouldn't be narrowing things down, but rather we should be, particularly in the time that we find ourselves in, we should be opening things so more people fall within the ambit of our deen. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. I'm sure you can think of quite a few examples that will suffice. Maybe I'll take you what's name now before I forget this word. Maybe COVID is a good example. So one guy asked me that, are you COVID or not COVID? The guy asked me, am I COVID or not COVID? So I said to him, no, I'm neither there nor there. So he said, that's impossible, can't be. Because you see, the conversation is supposed to go along the following lines: COVID or not COVID. So depending on the choice I make, you know, you used to play the games like Mario Brothers, and then you balang. You know, you like, they call it you butt, you know, the game's over. So now, if I were to say COVID and I'm speaking it, then I'm okay. If I say no COVID, then maybe, you know, balang. So now what happens is I say to the brother, no, I'm neither there nor there, which is no, that's impossible, can't be. You with me? Can there be a more nuanced approach to the whole? Can be a more nuanced approach to the. But if we take that look, the moment that if you don't have that particular view, then you know Allah forbid that you're not on the straight path any longer. And if you have the opposing view, then it depends who you're talking to. So then I wanted to remain a Muslim, so I don't talk COVID anymore. So I just like keep it safe, you know. You with me? Doctors differ about it, scholars differ about it. We live and let live. You know, without like compromising anybody, without disrespecting anybody, and so forth. We just live, and that is a solution to it. But if it becomes that's the line in the sand. That would be another example of, in terms of this type of overly strictness, in a sense that what is like broad can become so narrowed down a lot. For the
last night I was talking about the lecture, just sharing some thoughts. We're saying that an example of this minority and majority and the broadness and facing, showing an example of good leadership in the life of Rasulullah was the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, where everyone was saying, "On you're not on the truth. Why are you accepting these conditions in terms of the treaty?" But this is a good example of leadership where we don't go with the flow in terms of the rest, but you still show strength and maybe take a decision that doesn't look, but it was the start of the opening. It was a very good example.
No. So there you find the ultimate leadership in terms of the Prophet ﷺ. What many would seem and look, this is actually going against us. But in terms of outcome, if you look, it was a very prudent decision of the Prophet ﷺ in terms of what it actually led to. And as opposed to, the Muslims, numbers dwindling, it actually led to the increase in terms of Muslims, the numbers of Muslims increasing and so forth. So I think that now brings us to an end of that particular discussion in terms of we find ourselves within a context. Our response to the context are three. Either we assimilate, or number two is we live in the past, or number three is we sort of take a hardliner approach, which it's like shooting ourselves in the foot really, it doesn't help us, it doesn't help the cause of Islam. But understanding the context, I think it's important in terms of our leadership. So what happens is, the whole point, that was a tangent point now, but the whole point in terms of leadership is that what type of leadership should we be presenting to that overlap that we are currently experiencing. We find that not the Muslim community, but the broader community, they find themselves in a number of crises. So what we should do as leaders, leaders of our family, leaders of our community, what we should do is we should speak to those crises that the non-Muslim majority that we find ourselves in, crises that they are facing. But we as Muslims have the solution to those crises. So when we have the solution, we present them with the solution to these crises. What are they going to see us Muslims as? And we were jumping the gun yesterday in terms of talking about the gift of the givers as an example in that particular regard. We have a value add-on. So when we add value, then we endear ourselves in terms of this overlap and to the non-Muslim majority that we find ourselves in. And what does that do for Islam? That's number one. It will ensure our continued existence as a minority within the majority, because the majority would not want to dispense of us, because we are adding value as opposed to making demands all of the time. So we find ourselves within this particular context, and our leadership must take into consideration the context that we find ourselves in. Otherwise, if you're not aware of these things, and then, just look at the leader of your home, and you don't understand the context, and now you send your child to a Model C school. What you plug in there and what you get out, you're going to be shocked by it. And I think many of our elders, I'm talking about the generation before us, when a person, he used to work very hard, and only to do what? So that he could give his children a good education. In other words, so that they can get a good job and they can stand their own 2 feet and not be poverty-stricken like he is, not realizing that when he plugged his kids into the university, that he got more really than what he bargained for. It's like he was like sort of following a piper, and as he's going along, only after university, Allah forbid, when he's put into an old age home, he actually realizes where this piper was leading me to. So not understanding the context, you can't lead if you don't understand the context. Because it's just full, it doesn't make sense at all. And then there's going to be so much unintended negative consequences to the decisions that you make because you don't understand the context in terms of what you're doing. And sometimes we have like a certain, just education. I find so many people that they're the best of parents and they have the best of intentions. The unique thing about it, if you look at it, most of parents, what do they say? They say, I want to give my kids what I didn't get. Right? I'm telling the parent, don't deprive them of what you got. You want to give the kid what you didn't get, fine. Look, Ma, it's all right, man. And I can't see anything wrong with you. You're fine. So despite the fact what you didn't get, you're still okay. But now you want to give your kids what you didn't get, but then you deprive them, more importantly, of what you got. And that's a problem. And I think that you have like a one vision, man, in terms of not understanding the context. You think going to UCT is only an education. No, sure. Really, you're throwing caution to the wind. I'm not saying you can't do it, you can do it. But you need to be wary of the fact that this is a secular environment. Secular environment is fine. So you do what you do, I do what I do. You're going into a militant secular environment that they don't allow you to be anything else but secular. I'm not saying you mustn't send your kids there, that's a different discussion to be had. But you can't send your kid there thinking that they're just studying and they're just getting a degree and they're just getting a job. The brothers who are at university can say better in terms of like a form of, and I'm not using the word with a negative connotation attached to it. I'm using it in its archaic sense of the word. There's indoctrination happening. In other words, they're teaching you doctrine. It's just a modern doctrine. And then you're in that environment and then you start adopting those things. It's like a natural consequence. You go there and you come out like that. So understanding the context is for leadership as a leader of your family and so forth is fundamentally important. So we're talking a lot about what do you call that? We're talking a lot about the responses that we have, and then we spoke about the context, and we in this context, you and I as Muslims, how can we contribute? How can we contribute? How's it now? In a way that endears ourselves to the non-Muslim majority that we find ourselves. Why? Because we have solutions. We have solutions, and our leadership must be geared in a particular way. Habib Ali said a beautiful thing. He said, "What did the West give you? I mean, all of the modern day conveniences that we enjoy, quote unquote, is basically being produced by the West. And if you add to that Coca-Cola also, because wherever you go, you find Coca-Cola. If you look at the old peak of the Haram at Mina, there was Coca-Cola that time also there. But what did we give to the West? And we have something more valuable. So in our context, what we need to understand is that we need to, our leadership in terms of leading, we need to, what we have, contribute, see where the challenges are, and we have the solution to those particular challenges. So one of the challenges out there, and I alluded to it earlier on, and I said to you when I spoke about the application, what do we find? We find mental health disorders. It's a big challenge out there. One day in Itikaf, one of the students is studying in Egypt, Masood. He said to me that they have online programs, they have more than 1,000 students, mashallah. That's like a home-based Cape Town offering Arabic studies online. They have like more than 1,000 students. But he says most of his time really is spent with consultations in terms of people suffering from mental disorders. Yeah. And so this is a challenge out there in terms of the modern society that we live in. And it's particularly stark and to be found within young women. So what do they suffer from? They suffer from complexes in terms of their self-image. In other words, their perception of themselves. This leads to anxiety. It leads to depression. Depression leads to somewhat suicidal thoughts, and all of these and all of these things. So how can this is now, like we said earlier on, 50 years after women's liberation, has it actually contributed or not? No, it's not. We as Muslims, can we contribute positively in this particular way? Absolutely. In terms of a good Muslim with his identity in place and his ethics and morals in place is immune from depression. You don't realize it unless you see the opposite person who doesn't have that identity and who doesn't have that Islamic personality makeup. Then you will only see it. And our Muslim kids, like they said to me, this girl wants to enroll herself. I said, no, they must come to the awal. Don't worry, very soon, once she starts learning the Asma'ullah al-Husna, and you know what it actually means, you know, and then automatically all of these issues will sort of dissipate. So the Prophet ﷺ has said this before, عَجَبًا لِأَمْرِ الْمُؤْمِنِ إِنَّ أَمْرَهُ كُلَّهُ لَهُ خَيْرٌ. Wondrous is the fear of the believer. إِنَّ أَمْرَهُ كُلَّهُ, whatever his circumstances are, it is good for you. Think about, this is our psychology. It's part of your DNA, part of your makeup. But other people don't have this. So sometimes we don't realize what blessing we are in just to be a Muslim. So what happens to a believer? إِنْ أَصَابَتْهُ ضَرَّاءُ صَبَرَ وَكَانَ خَيْرًا. If there's an adversity, what does he do? Exercise patience, and it's good for you. Because, you know, adversity, you grow. You take a nail, you knock it into the wall. The harder you knock it in, the more firm it becomes embedded. You become stronger. You're always looking for the silver lining of the cloud. If this didn't happen, and that didn't happen, and this is how you psychologically look at it. So it's good for you. وَإِنْ أَصَابَتْهُ سَرًّا. If goodness befalls him, what does he do? Shakara. He's grateful. وَكَانَ خَيْرًا لَهُ. And it's good for you. I think the most powerful psychological tool that a believer has that protects him from all depression, anxiety, and all of that. You tell me what it is. I've seen this happen like countless of times, practical expressions. There's one formula. Anything happened to him, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. How do you feel after you say that? You feel contented. You think, it's sorted out. Lillahi ma akhad. One day, what happened was, my father, rahimahullah, he bought a caravan. That time caravan was like, like a nice thing to have. But this one he bought and he like built it up like sort of. He never used to go to the banks, rahimahullah, ever. So if you wanted something, you used to like build it up and like that type of thing. So it was a nice one. It was an olive green one, and the full spectrum and everything. But the caravan has a problem with the starter and the fuel and the engine burning out. One day, my father and mother went to Kirstenbosch Gardens. Maybe they went to walk around there, I don't know. He came, he turned the key, and didn't start. Turned the key, and he smelled petrol. He turned it again, poof, our engine, So he's stuck right now in Kirstenbosch. So he calls my brother. I didn't know he called my elder brother. So my elder brother, he said, like he's like obviously caught in the emotion of the loss of the van. The van burnt up. So he's telling my brother. So my brother tells him, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. So it gave him like thought, like, look, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. So he's like forgetting that the thing burnt out now because we get Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Then he calls me, unbeknown to me that he called my brother before. So he tells me the thing burnt out. I say, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. He starts thinking, he told us afterwards, he starts thinking to himself, what am I worried about? Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. You follow? It's like, Ajib, if you see people who don't, you find yourself sometimes in a situation whereby you forget Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, and then you are reminded about it. And I saw the out of the Awwal Masjid. I think we'll end up on this point, inshallah, then we'll talk. There's one thing that we can help in terms of the Muslim majority there out there. Butamala is an old gentleman. He was instrumental in building the Leeuwen Street Masjid in Leeuwen Street in Buka. Leeuwen Street Masjid just coincidentally happened to be our family masjid because we were in District 6. But when you move, like you always had the masjid, and despite the fact that wherever you stayed, you just went to after the madrasa and so. Because my grandfather also was instrumental in helping to build the masjid, so it becomes your masjid, and you're born there and you'll die there and so forth. Things have changed now, obviously, in that regard. So Butamala, he was instrumental in building the masjid there, but now he comes to Awal Masjid. He's a regular musalli there. One day he came and he's a bit like a hunchback, so he walks like this with his hands like this. So he makes quite a, you notice him in, this elderly gentleman who walk like this, and he's quite spry and healthy, and, mashallah, I think it's his tahajjud. Every morning he stands up for tahajjud. The reason why is because you're asking sometimes because he's got a lot of time, but now he's finished, bacha is finished, he wants some more stuff to do in the morning so that, he can fill up his time. So what happened, Butamala comes out of the masjid, and further up the road, and I'm watching now, he's walking, and further up the road, there's a non-Muslim gentleman. He happened to open his door, and somebody nicked the door. So they nicked the door. That's a musibah, isn't it? It's a catastrophe. And you can measure the degree of that catastrophe by the response of the non-Muslim gentleman. Butamala walks past and he looks now at the door like that, and he makes like that, and he says, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. And he's like half smiling, because look here, Inna lillahi wa inna means so much. Nothing got nicked. There's nothing you can do about it. You can lose your head. You can, go to see your psychiatrist tomorrow. You can pay 154 and all of it. Unnecessary. All of it unnecessary. I can just tell you, look here, we solve this problem. And you just say from the bottom of your heart, look here, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. You with me? Sajib, we don't, some of our ulama, it's very simple. Sometimes I'm glad I'm actually able to put this point across, like you seem to be understanding what I'm saying, because it's such a simple thing, but the simple things in life sometimes is difficult to explain. Like just Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, what it means for a believer, subhanAllah. So, point being that we're in a context, right? And we have this overlap. In terms of the overlap, we find that, look here, the non-Muslims, and we need to have a value add-on in terms of what we have in terms of our deen. What are they suffering from? A number of things. So we must be that ummah of rahmah, to bring that mercy to them. Where are they suffering? People are suffering greatly. One of the areas they're suffering in terms of mental health and so forth. Islam has the solutions for those things. We must present those solutions to them. We must, like if you think of it in this way, why would you deprive somebody of this beautiful deen? As you make da'wah to the person, tell them you can embrace this thing, that this deen, this way of life, that all, it's like a balsam, man. It's like a salve for all of your problems, So inshallah, tomorrow we'll talk a bit more about some of the other problems that they have and how we can help. And I'm doing very well, man. I prepped one lesson and I'm stretching it for 3 lessons. Subhanallah. It's like in deen also, you have to be less is more. Like you less and you get like a lot of rewards. But I will have to prepare now today also, inshallah, and we'll start talking about personalities maybe from tomorrow, and give a few examples of real life leaders who like understand the context and who represent the context and who are giving us that understanding of deen. Quran and Sunnah is all the same. People can tell you, but it's the understanding and application where we differ. So leaders that give you, Quran and Sunnah based on a good understanding and appreciation in terms of our city and so forth, and therefore we become effective and meaningful in terms of our existence, not only within ourselves but in relation to those around us as well. Allah grant us the tawfiq. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah.
How to strike the balance between